The reason for the discussion, and I think it's an unusual reason, an unusual story, is that you won't find too many academic institutions commissioning architects to do projects, particularly faculty members, for all the political reasons and economic reasons and so on. So I think it's, as you know, SCI-Arc does this and has done it for 10 years in the gallery. And for a school that prides itself on saying SCI-Arc is about the tradition of non-tradition, there is a tradition that grew up in the last 3 or 4 years where the graduation pavilion is designed and built for the graduation and then torn down and rebuilt in a different way by a different architect, and so on, which has come to be a significant piece of the celebration of graduation. And you know, Dwayne and Jenny's pavilion, which was done 2 years ago and then remodeled the last year, and Alexis has done it several times, and so on. So it's important, I think, from my point of view, to realize what that means, and we'll talk about that a little, what it means in terms of the school's willingness. So I think this is, for us, an important moment and an unusual opportunity. And we ran, and just to briefly go through the history, we ran this competition. We got a grant, I think it was about $250,000 to do the competition and to build the building. So is it Art Place? Art Place. So I don't know too much about who gave it, but the intention was not only to further the discussion of art and architecture here, but to extend that discussion into the community and to make the community nominally the arts district part of the discourse at SCI-Arc. So we decided, instead of asking Alexis or Dwayne and Jenny to run a competition, and instead of, given the amount of money that we had available, and instead of replacing the pavilion after a year, that because of the magnitude of the investment, that we would put it up and we would leave it up for 4 years. So this is still temporary in the long run of buildings in the pedigree of architecture. This is a short time, but for SCI-Arc, which turns these things over year after year, we're doing this pavilion. We're going to construct it. It'll be constructed by the end of May of this year. So we're running this as a seminar studio with Marcelo, as some of you may know. So it should be up by the end of May. It will be up by the end of May. We got different problems, which I'm sure we can solve. So I think it's important to know that for all of you, what we do and why we do it, and what the opportunity represents for the school and for the neighborhood and for the architects who participated. So what we want to do is take a few minutes to talk about what each architect did, and then discuss the projects in a critical way. So I think we just do the obvious, and maybe we can start. Do you have a mic there, Ramiro? Yeah. Yeah. And just briefly tell us a little bit about. I think I mentioned this the other day. There's a Spanish proverb, a famous proverb, that says, "Tell me to what you pay attention, and I'll tell you who you are." So I know you're not from Madrid. You might be from Barcelona, right? But in that light, maybe you could tell us what you did and what distinguishes it in terms of content in a brief way.
Well, my interest with the project is also part of a general set of interests in terms of the relationship between objects and fields. And so the idea that the pavilion as an object, as a temporary object, the problem of how that gets addressed in a particular form. And so I think the idea of a tumbleweed, or the image of a tumbleweed, was a kind of good, let's say, metaphor for me, in the sense that tumbleweeds become objects and figures once their roots.
Can I ask you to do me a small favor, and I don't want to interrupt unduly, but objects and fields and tumbleweeds, if we were talking to students and saying objects, fields, tumbleweeds, wouldn't be the conventional way of saying this is my building. Right. So in case anybody is listening who doesn't know what any of those things mean, I think it would be helpful to try to do this as specifically as you can and as personally as you can and as jargon-free as you can, and to give students a chance. So students are criticized for relying on straight and clean and porosity and context and whatever else it is, and explain it a little bit more in the terms that I'm talking about.
Okay, so by object, I mean a kind of singular, well-defined thing that kind of occupies a space. And by field, either a multiplicity or repetition of, let's say, smaller elements, or an extension or expansion of those across a kind of lateral terrain. And so seeing the site as a kind of, let's say, field of objects, cars, or field of parking stripes, like that would be one reading of understanding a kind of given field condition. And then the object, the quality of the object, again, this idea of the temporary nature, the rootlessness of the object, in this case being a temporary thing. So that became very important in terms of not manifesting or showing any kind of permanent connection to the ground, that it's kind of like a tumbleweed got trapped in the kind of corner of the parking lot. And so it kind of reveals its temporary nature. And then the connection, one of the problems is, trying to establish a connection of that object that is not foundational. That's where the kind of graphic seating layout came into play in terms of producing a kind of graphic field that began to
stand in front of the project.
I don't know if this will.
It's a small room.
Yeah, I
hear
don't
you.
So the idea that the seating layout is a kind of graphic, well, I'm considering both of them objects and fields, and I'll try to explain that. But the idea that the graphic layout, and all of this is kind of working with materials from parking or road materials, so pavement or asphalt painting, as well as reflectors that mark this thing. And so there's a kind of dumb object-like shape to it, but it produces a field through its kind of repetition of elements. And then that begins to accumulate around the object in a way to kind of help situate it and ground it. And so there was actually another name I had, another title that came up with this thing. I don't know if anyone knows Pigpen from Peanuts. But the idea of this kind of character, wherever he goes, followed by a kind of cloud of dirt or dust. And so the idea that there's a kind of strong figure of the outline, there's this kind of just mess of kind of dust of stuff kind of following it. But I went with tumbleweed more because it's a kind of more understandable object in terms of a temporary thing. But so I think given that, the idea that this thing is a kind of temporary object, I wasn't so much interested in, let's say, housing all the seating in it or providing for a kind of full functioning enclosed thing, but actually just providing kind of partial coverage for smaller events, and then having the larger events that happen, maybe a few times a year at most.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Sorry to interrupt, but
So My project actually comes from the realization that I thought the project of the pavilion in the school was kind of a still life exercise, meaning that it is always the same object that people are designing, and year after year, the thing that distinguishes one from the other is mainly a stylistic exercise, in the same way as painters design or paint apples and fruit or flowers in different ways, and it's not really about the subject, or it's not really about what people perceive when this is a subject, is just about the technical exercise. It is really a conversation among practitioners, the problem of the pavilion as it was posed, I think, in the past 10 years, from SCI-Arc to the architects. And I thought that project was, in my opinion, limited, especially when we talk about the fact that the grants was given to SCI-Arc in order for SCI-Arc to have a presence in the city, not only in the school. It was not anymore an internal exercise or an internal discussion among practitioners. I thought it needed to open up. And so that's why I thought that Tableau vivant was the opposite, in a way, of still nature in painting. Tableau vivant is a very specific way of understanding representation, where actually the subject that sees a representation is part of the picture plane. And it's a moment that I think is very important, because the pavilion wanted to engage the user in the way in which they occupy the space, and it was not just a hope to have a new stylistic approach to the same problem. So that was a little bit the critique that, or anyway, the take from my end towards this project. I also really wanted this to be an engaging pavilion for the community at large, not only one day a week and one day in the year, but really during the entire year. And I thought was needed in the school was the idea of a garden. So still nature, that was also the sense of the subject of the graphic, was really reinterpreting the idea of nature and the idea of giving to SCI-Arc a place to rest and have lunch, and not only a moment for graduation. Also, that informed a lot the way in which the graphic has been composed, because all the elements of the graphics come from scanning technologies that then get scripted into the abstract. So the hope was to create a relationship between geometry and photorealism. And the photorealism clearly has a subject, the idea of the garden for downtown.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks. Hi, okay, this works. All right, so the project, which you can see right behind Eric and me here, has to do with what we were doing in the office this summer, which is what I would call figures in a sack. And for those of you in my studio right now, we're continuing that. Hey, Juan. The operative terms there relating to creating form that has tension embedded within it. Form where you're not just sort of lackadaisically sculpting form, but that you're actually creating form through synthetic materiality, or let's say a kind of fake stretching of a material that could never actually be that material at scale, like a rubber sack. So you'll see flying by here in a minute some examples of things sort of pressing into other things. On the one hand, a highly articulated figure, like a fist pushing through a rubber sheet, or volumetric figures pushing out on a sack. So that's where the basic language for the piece comes from. On another level, I was interested personally in getting away from the roof version of what a pavilion generally is and what this thing kind of wanted to be, because of the number of seats and the limited budget, and I kept finding myself going that direction, but I've done a pavilion like that before, so I was really insistent on this one to do a building object. And so important for me in the object here was that it was a mass, that it felt massive, and that also that it had that it came with its own ground, which is something that I'm asking of a lot of my own projects these days, that they come with their own ground. They're not expecting much from the ground, they come with their own ground. So that the idea, I guess the most important thing for me, other than the stretching and the squishing and all of that kind of lexicon, was the idea that the thing had some protection to it, but also came around, became massive, and had its own ground, so that it could be, you could feel it as a three-dimensional interior space.
So, well, I mean, we had like very simple ideas, I guess, in the beginning. The first one, maybe it's a kind of more a confession. We were like trying to aim for something that will make a really great proposal, but will like guarantee that we wouldn't win. And I guess that didn't really work out very well. But I mean, it's a little bit of a joke.
You're trying to lose.
Yes, it's a bit of a joke, but it's not. I mean, it began that way, but strategically, we wanted to put the project, in the place that will have the most intensity for the school, given that, it was...
It's just an odd thing to say.
Yeah.
So if at least half seriously, half
Yes.
facetiously,
Yes.
you started out to do this in
Yes.
order to lose.
Yes.
So what would be the design decision that would guarantee that you would lose? What did you do to lose?
Okay, the two things that we thought, it would be a losing thing. It's A, that we wouldn't hover horizontal, that like a normal pavilion will have to, but we will actually produce shadow by being vertical, which means that, it's a little bit, if you wanted to use the brief actually asked for a pavilion to be used at a particular moment in time, which is 1 day, 2 hours during the year. The rest of the time, it's actually non-specified, so we thought, let's really take advantage of that and not do a thing that will sit empty on the parking lot. So, again, follow my narrative. I don't think it actually will work that way, but we thought that by making something so high that will seem like completely odd and so far away from the school, because it will be in the corner, it will be a non sequitur, I see what you call it, like this is not a winning scheme, but. So, this is jokes aside, but we did have that idea. But the idea that to make something that it will represent the school as a kind of mark, so when it's not used as a pavilion, meaning it's not casting shadow, which is 99% of the time, and it's not being functional, it doesn't feel empty in the parking lot. It doesn't feel empty because there's not, it practically has no footprint. And by being on that corner can become a kind of quote-unquote an institutional beacon, as we call it, basically bearing sire name, having the inscription of the institution, and being able to at least broadcast what we are about to a slightly different audience that have nothing to do with the school, meaning like just passers-by and so on. Those are maybe the two fundamental ideas.
So we got a tumbleweed, we got a garden, we got a fist, not a fist pump, we got a fist punch, and we got a guy trying to lose. So again, a little bit facetiously, in a conceptual way, there's very little, I should say this, I don't think it's mandatory that an exotic, overly complicated, difficult to understand explanation correlates with a complicated piece of architecture. So you're not obligated necessarily to produce something which is esoteric when it comes out of your mouth. I think you're more obligated to produce something esoteric that comes off your hand or hands. I think that's important to understand, because when for me, especially talking to students and trying to explain to students how practicing architects think about projects, the first thing that struck me, I think Elena said this, is that this is a discussion within SCI-Arc. You said something like that.
It is.
So let me put it another way. If this were a discussion with the parents who were arriving at graduation, not contemplating tumbleweeds and fist pumps, in a very brief way, because we have so many people, everybody gives a speech, we kill it. But in a brief way, how would you account, in a more prosaic way, in a more pragmatic way, how would you account for what you did? I mean, I thought about doing this, having different people present other people's projects, which is sometimes, because I could talk about your projects in terms of a kind of redundancy and a sort of structural efficiency, and like, holy shit, can we build this thing? Can we build it? And that there's a lot of what you did that has to do with dealing with those kinds of questions. I mean, it's part of the argument, isn't it?
Sure. I think the argument was that the pavilion
But you didn't say anything about that.
has been too much of an internal conversation, and the hope that the fact that we got this grant from the city made it for me very important that this conversation was actually open to the city, to the parents, whoever you want to put there. I thought it's time for SCI-Arc actually to engage something beyond formalistic expressions and that was really what I was trying to do in a way. That something that was a dialogue between the people using the pavilion and a bigger public, and not just a conversation among practitioners. I mean,
But
take it
so
or leave
are
it, I
you
think
saying it's not, you're trying to do something
I think
as a,
that
would you, let
the
me put it another way.
conversation
How would you compare
can
what you
go
did to
on
what every,
parallel tracks, meaning we can have a conversation about the specificity of how certain things are produced, which are quite sophisticated, and then we talk the language we talk, but then I think there is a narrative that I think needs to be responsible for a larger audience. And the hope of the garden
are you
was-
speaking that language? Huh?
I think the pavilion does,
The building?
yeah. I mean,
Would
I wouldn't-
you take a crack at comparing what you did to what everybody else did? Do you think they're all the same? Do you think somebody could walk in the room and say, you guys all do the same thing?
No, I think there are two major schemas. I think they're very similar, in my opinion, the two schemas that Marcelo did and Ramiro did, which is a wall. I mean, it's a schema that actually we talked about several times before. I mean, Zagwe talked about it several times to all of us, that really what SCI-Arc needed was just a wall casting a shadow. And that diagram was very clear to all of us. And I think the choice was, I think we chose to comply to the request, and they decided to do the diagram of the wall and the shadows. And I think this is a big difference between the two projects, between the two groups of projects. Then my sense is that the shadow project has a narrative that is more understandable, a poetic that is much more understandable. I think Ramiro's project is a bit more personal about his own personal approach towards certain formal manipulation. I would say it's a bit more esoteric in that sense. I think the project of the shadow is a quite simple one, frankly. It just does one thing.
Well, let me ask Tom this.
Tom builds buildings, whether or not there is a budget for it.
There is a budget.
But I would say among the four projects, I told you, I like his the most. If we would have $1 million or two, then I would say that this is actually
$1 million project.
that's the one to build. Yeah.
Because?
Because I don't know. I personally like
I have to
it
answer
the
that,
most.
and I'm sorry to get too specific technically maybe, but I mean, the thing, although it does, the design itself precedes my ability to conceive of how it would be built. I want to say that for sure. This does not come out of material research. This was a design that I intuitively wanted to work on. But as we worked on it, we found some parity between the formal language and then the act of kind of shrink wrapping or stretching, and actual people who shrink wrap military things like helicopters and tanks and things like that for transport. We found a company in Arizona and talked with them, and it actually helped develop the project where we could literally find a way, and it's a very cheap way. This stuff costs nothing because it's just wrapping.
But you leave out an important point. You're not, I mean, whatever they do with tanks and whatever they do with shrink wrapping, but you haven't connected that with the meaning of what you're doing. I mean, why is that a point to be made in a discussion about what you did?
Because I find that if you can't find a way to engage the technical and material sides of a project, that you're basically a concept artist.
Right, but then that would mean it would be implausible as a piece of construction. So you're telling us you know how to build it, but you're not telling us why.
I guess I'm saying, yeah.
You're not telling, you know what I'm going to say, but you're not telling us why it is that it's important to build that in that way in this context for this client.
Well, I could speak about the project in a completely different way than I spoke about it 2 minutes ago, which would be one that I might present to a client, and maybe partially how I might have presented it to you and the jury on the day, which is that it's also intended to, the reason why it's located where it is, which is actually where Dwayne's is standing right now, was part of a larger idea to engage the front of the school, create a situation which...
What is the front of the school again?
Well, it's the informal front of the school now, but I wanted to formalize it by creating a kind of a plaza, which I'm calling the SCI-Arc Quad, of which this building would be part of, but there would be the covered area of that, where it would become the lunchroom and also even the classroom, place for reviews potentially as well. And then thinking about that as a SNU kind of anchor point for also the future development on the additional sites which are currently gravel and dirt. So I kind of wanted it to be a link between the SCI-Arc entry, the parking lot, and then whatever happens in the sites.
Traction.
Towards traction.
So how would you evaluate? We've talked almost not at all. I think Marcelo mentioned it as a way guaranteed to lose. But in a serious way, nobody has said anything about why it is where it is until you said what you just said, which presumably has a relationship. It's not so clear what you mean by front to go into a kind of old discussion. It's not clear what you mean by front, or even if there were a front. I mean, nobody can find a goddamn door, a SCI-Arc, never mind.
I mean, I actually think I got it wrong. Looking at Marcelo's losing entry, I mean, I think it's honestly, I find it the best one because...
Well, that was the question.
It's because it's assigned for the school, and it makes it actually answers your question.
That's right.
So I think that's what
I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, it's on the corner, it's next to the bridge, it has an association with the bridge. And I guess the alternative would be at the foot of traction, meaning at the east end of traction, which sets up a relationship, if you want to call it that, a sort of conventional relationship up and down traction for whatever that's worth, as opposed to what is pretty clearly the corner when you're heading over the bridge or coming back, and the relationship to the bridge and so on.
That's right. But I mean, I also see that SCI-Arc is bisected in a way, and it has Alexis's old Pavilion there, which is in fact it's the de facto lunchroom for SCI-Arc, and there are the lunch trucks out there. People are eating there. It is a kind of entry foyer, let's say, to the school. It's very informal, although I thought for 2 seconds about putting it on the front corner, I thought it's also, in order to integrate it as kind of an extra, almost an addition to SCI-Arc, I would get as close as I possibly could to that area.
Let me ask something a little bit more general. Maybe it's Marcelo's turn to take a shot. When you do a project like this, and there are a couple of constituencies, I would say. One is you people, the SCI-Arc constituency, and that could be students, I think primarily students, but faculty and board and everybody else. And there's also the neighborhood, the local gentry, and so on and so on. So if you're talking to the school when you do what you do, and you're talking to the neighborhood when you do what you do, there's probably one more we ought to throw into this. I try not to make it too complicated, which is who the parents and grandparents and all of you who show up in the pavilion for graduation, not to say lectures and so on and so on. So the question is really, what's the conversation you're having? In other words, somebody shows up and sees what and understands what. In terms of the winning entry, let's start with that. About SCI-Arc, about you, about students. So what's the meaning? What's the representational meaning, aside from whether it operates? And what does it mean to do something like that in this neighborhood for this school at this point in time?
Okay, I didn't see that being the final point, because I thought you were going to. I mean, I think addressing different audiences is a challenge, and I think a discussion among architects and in a pedagogic way, and especially at SCI-Arc level, is one. Addressing, the neighborhood, the constituency, let's say, like arguing for putting something in the corner beyond establishing our presence on that corner, also establishes something that is from SCI-Arc, but it's also not enough from SCI-Arc that could, whereas the limits could be negotiated and discussed. The community somehow could actually be involved in a way of using that pavilion or structure for events and so on. I mean, what is the meaning? I'm usually a little bit resistant lately to try to explain myself in terms of like certain more stylistic decisions. I don't mind doing that, but whether that has any meaning to the audience, not students, but parents or the neighborhood, I think what I will argue is that I will try to stay out of the way of that as possible. As much as possible means that if there's a meaning to the things we do, and there's certainly a meaning in terms of like sources, in terms of things we're looking at, in terms of things we're trying to experiment, it will have to not interfere with all those things that one will commonly assume as like, function. I mean, in this case, the main important things were two things: the producing enough shadow so you could actually comfortably, be on a ceremony like that. And the other one is like, framing event, which is a ceremony, in a way that produces enough of a backdrop, ceremonial backdrop, that will offer, the best possible frame for what it is actually a special day. That sounds like overly political, but those are things that I think matter. Then, of course, we can talk about like, why do I want to distribute tape in such a way? I think these are maybe discussions.
But here's the distinction, because I think it's useful for me as part of the jury discussion, and maybe useful for the students and the faculty to look at these things typologically. When Elena was talking in a more hyperbolic way about her project, and I said, it's a series of frames. It's 9 frames. You could talk about it as an assembly of modules in a systematic way, in a redundant way. You could do that. But if you looked at, let's say, the extremes, Tom's and Elena's on one hand, and Ramiro's and Marcelo's on the other hand, because to some extent you're making an enclosure and a building, so you're literally orchestrating by precluding what's external to the space in years and in years. Whereas arguably you can do whatever the hell you want pretty much in and around years. We probably get to talking about open systems, which is an old discussion. But the question in your case, or in Marcelo's case, is it's so open. Is it so open that it's irrelevant, really? You can do almost anything in and around yours in almost any organizational way. It doesn't obligate you to much of anything. Whereas if you look at Elena's and you look at Tom's is literally a building. Yours is pretty close. So as strategic approaches to the project, one is an object around which any number of things could happen. And the object doesn't really, as a matter of fact, in your case, you could argue the object gets in the way. Because if you wanted to surround something, for instance, it's not clear how it was. Why don't you comment on that?
Yeah, I think the kind of versatility, or let's say the issue of flexibility in the project, was an intentional thing.
Yeah, but wait a second, because flexibility is another one of these things. So if Mies builds a box in Berlin and says it's a flexible, I'm talking about the top floor, not the bottom of it. See, he builds a box. And he says, okay, this is a flexible space. Within this container, you can do anything you want. So the line flexible has to engage what might happen. Right. If what you're doing is floating over the stage or going in and out of the event, then it really doesn't facilitate anything at all, unless you said something very different, that you would have to produce a very specific event. It's like the argument about museums that are very prescriptive versus museums that are more neutral, and there are advantages for both. If you make something as peculiar as you made, and then you say it facilitates flexibility, it seems to me you would have a better case if you said, this is so unusual, shape-wise, view-wise. Sometimes you can see, sometimes you can't kind of see, sometimes you can't see anything. then use that in a very prescriptive way to define the use of it and make the shape you made obligate the use of the pavilion. Because this way it seems like you're arguing in two different directions.
No, but the pavilion, the nature of the pavilion, I mean, the fact that pavilions are generic because of their temporary nature means that I didn't want it to lock it into a very specific prescription of use. But the fact that, almost anything can happen.
But
there,
it's so specific. What I'm saying is, if
Formally
you
it's
take the
specific.
Mies argument, which is a sort of neutrality, and very defined in terms of perimeter, in terms of lid, in terms of floor, and all of that. So all you've done is outline it to some extent. Elena did that, and even to some extent, in a more exotic way, Tom did that too. But you have something which is at least nominally, let's say, very idiosyncratic. So it would seem like it could be a response if you were talking to a client about this, that if you, here's the piece, here's the other piece, here's the other piece, and it's flying all over the place. And the client says to you, if I move this 2 meters, is that okay? And the answer to that is what?
No, maybe half a meter is okay.
Because
No,
it
but I
seems to
think
me,
that
if
this
you
is a-
do architecture, the answer is you touch it, and either I quit or I'm
I don't
fired.
think so. I don't think that way. I mean, I think there's a loose territory for things to move. I don't think those
But it
lines
looks
are
very.
so
What I'm saying is, it's made in a way that looks extremely precise.
That's also because, that has to do with resolution, I think, also. Right? So meaning that if you look at the plan of this thing, there is a calibration of different zones of use, meaning in terms of scale and spaces to walk through. There's a diagram that's missing that I couldn't find on the boards, but it breaks those zones down so that there's one zone that's really centered on, let's say, the main stage that actually covers 200 seats, and there's a main stage inside. The other zones are much more informal, and stages are placed outside of that for the other 4 smaller seating areas.
And those would be used based on where the sun is? Is that what you're saying?
Right. So morning sun, you'd get
Suppose you
shadow
wanted to
in the
use them
afternoon.
all at once,
You can.
all the way around.
You couldn't for one event. You could do it for multiple events at the same time.
Because it looks potentially like the most interesting use of the thing would be to fill it up and use it all.
That might be the case, but I think visually it wouldn't work because the structural elements get in the way from
Exactly.
looking at all of them towards the center. That's why each of the smaller seating areas have
But
their
you could
own
make
stage.
that piece in a way that would allow you to use all of the seating venues.
Possibly, yeah.
And look through it if you obligated
Right.
yourself, hypothetically.
True.
Do you understand yours? Do you see the similarity between yours and Romero's versus Tom and Elena? Or you don't?
But mine's not a wall. Mine is still a space that encloses.
Which one is a wall?
Well, Marcelo's is more vertical, so let's say more wall-like.
Yeah, I mean,
Mine's still
ours
horizontal.
definitely vertical.
Oh, Elena said it was a wall.
Yeah. Yeah, in that
I'm
sense,
saying
I
it's
would
not.
say, I will tend to agree that we're closer with Ramiro in terms of the position, but then I think the orientation, like for me, being at the corner means that somehow it had to be vertical in a way. Like for some reason, I saw the coupling of those ideas that you couldn't, that it wouldn't be the same thing, you know, like, yeah.
But a wall implies something which is more two-dimensional. That's sure as hell not two-dimensional, that thing.
Okay, it's a stage. It is not a building.
It's what?
It's a stage. It's a backdrop of a stage, and that's, I think that maybe, but the diagram is that one. I mean, at the
You
end
mean,
of the
but
day, it's
how about
the
it's a
idea that the
how about it's a
shadows is-
proscenium?
proscenium, fine.
Yeah.
That's
Like
different.
The difference between, when we talked
a
about the
flight
diagrams, I remember we were all at lunch. Actually, you were not at lunch. But with Zago, we said, well, what they really want at SCI-Arc is really a wall. And I think at the end, it's true. It's like what they really need is a wall. And the wall is more or less decorated in terms of a sign towards the city. But more or less, I think
But it's
they're
not,
the same
but
diagram.
no, but it's, I mean, I don't think I was in that lunch.
there either. I don't know. I was just thinking, I don't
We were all at the
And
Mexican
then I was thinking-
restaurant.
I was thinking, if that's what he thought, then why did he do a bunch of horizontal flying,
know, yeah.
flying Mack trucks?
Yes.
We
But
were
I
all
think-
at the
Were we
Mexican
there?
restaurant
Were we?
after the meeting with Moss. And he mentioned it 3 times, so I thought if he didn't do it, then it was not the winning scheme as well, I guess.
Who mentioned it?
Zago. 10 times. So.
Sago.
Yeah.
Must have been the margarita.
But I think, just to be clear, when you look at what he's doing, it seems, I mean, look at the images, it's volumetric. A wall is planar. I mean, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with a wall, except in the sense that if you say, if one thing separates X from Y,
Yeah, I
it
think you
separates
don't-
the street from the bleachers. And it looks like, even the little pavilions on the side look like backstage green room spaces or something. In other words, you could stage something out of it, and it's a lid. It's doing this. It's like,
You asked me to be synthetic and to explain it, so I did. No, so then the big characterization might not fulfill every single aspect, but I think there are 2 different diagrams, 2 and 2, and I think that's...
I think what's, I mean, I don't know if this is related, but to me, I was trying to explain, I think with the students, like what it is to do a project for a client, let's say, when the client asks you to do a project and you are like having a conversation one-to-one, and, you know, even your own language, your own ideas, but you engage that. And what it is to actually submit a project for a competition where you know that you're not only, and if you do this quite a bit, and we do this quite a bit, I mean, I know some of you, I mean, Tom does it quite a bit, you get a particular intuition about it, which sometimes I would say is maybe counterproductive, which is not only to produce your own idea, but also to learn to second guess certain strategic conditions, which means like you want to make sure that your ideas, your stylistic predilections, your material predilections, all your intuitions go on the right direction. And I think, it has something to do with strategy in a way. And I think, I don't know if all these people would have done the same project, would have been the commission be directed to them, specifically, meaning this is a budget, this is a time, this is what you have to do. Not there be a competition. Probably, we will see the
Can you
same
explain
features.
that a little bit? Because presumably there's a conceptual strategy.
Yeah.
And there's an organizational strategy, a spatial strategy, a material strategy, a budget strategy. There's certainly
Yes.
an idea about where it is relative
Exactly.
to the bridge and the building,
Yeah.
all of that stuff. But what does that have to, aside from second guessing the fact that you were aspiring to lose?
Well, that maybe,
Which is an interesting strategy. So
Well, but
that strategy
would
didn't
have
work
had-
very well.
If I came to you in a meeting and I'd say, here's my idea, I want to put it in this corner, I don't know. If I were you, I would have said, well, are people going to, let's say, take away the graduation day, that people are just going to walk what they have to walk? Is it that far away from the school? The people eat lunch in Alexis.
You think that's what I would have said? How
No,
far
I'm saying maybe that's what I would say. Or I would have just raised those questions, which are more logical. To me, this is what interesting is about, not only just commissioning an architect on the school, but also launching a competition, which means that, there's this inherent idea of a contest, which is, who comes out with a good idea. I don't want to say a better idea because I don't think there's a better idea, but what's the more maybe proper idea on a certain context means that, whatever the 4 projects are produced, that's the context you have. You don't have all the other ones.
There's a discussion of competitions that has to be acknowledged whether you succumb to it or not, which has to do with second guessing the jury. Jeff just showed one the other night with the Angevante, and he a lot of talk about that jury since for months. But you didn't do this based on what you thought.
I don't think it's second guessing. For me, it's not second guessing the jury so much, and this is maybe not the right competition, but let's say in a competition where you know that you're competing against hundreds, it's second guessing the 2 or 3 moves that everyone is going to try to make, And so try to stay away as much as possible from those, maintain a certain level of legibility. You don't want to just put yourself in a corner in that the project is completely inviable just to make something different. I don't believe in that, but maybe this is not the right project for it. But
You didn't do that.
I didn't do that to a certain extent, but I'm saying I think it's just.
I think
it's an interesting problem.
Like one of the most concrete examples of that, in my experience, is whether or not to break the rules of the competition. Like I'm always tortured by that at the beginning, and
You have to challenge
whether or
them,
not- But as you say, it depends on the competition. How many
Sure.
people are doing it? Who's on the jury? Who's the chairman of the jury? What do I think is going to go down in that particular country? And that helps you determine whether or not you're going to break the rules. And sometimes I get the feeling intuitively that it's imperative to break the rules in order to even be considered. So other competitions, no way. You got to stay in. There will be something written in the brief where you know there are going to be enough people, 6 or 7 people from the city there, making sure that you stick to the guidelines of the budget for a particular city or whatever it is, and it's a no-go if you try to break the rules. So I don't know.
Tough to make that guess,
It is.
actually.
It is, and I'm sure I guess wrong.
There's some famous ones, but not the Angewandte, but take like the Sydney Opera House.
Absolutely.
Where you can't produce an opera, never mind a concert, in any building in the competition.
No, that's right.
And there's always the question about whether somebody, and it's usually not everybody, it's usually somebody. So there's someone who understands, who will look at things either in a different way or in a way that might be coincident with you, and will say, wait a minute, I don't give a damn whether they broke the rule or not, but having broken it, what they've done is an act of invention and imagination and genius. Let's keep it in. Or somebody else from the city or from the country is saying, you can't block the view of the mountains. Right. I love the mountains. You're out. And a lot of that has I think, to do with the nature of the jury. The question, I guess, in this case, is whether that had anything to do with anything anybody did.
Well, but I think, for instance, just to put,
or whether anybody would admit it.
But let's say if you go through the projects, this will be my quick reading. Tom did I was surprised to see the project. Tom did, a sort of enclosed building, something that would be like a classroom, and that's an interesting take, or a different take, no? It wasn't in the brief. Ramiro did something that actually has trouble, being recognized as an object, let's say. It's hard to see what the shape of it, so it's the least recognizable of all of them. And Elena did something which is incredibly graphic, and it's I don't know, it has a sort of quality of being super flat, on some level intense, on the other level, very simple. I don't know. I think those are, we did something vertical that will be cast shadow and not have no footprint. These are 4 different ideas, that then, I guess, I don't know whether each of us thought that would be a game changer, but definitely will be something that it wouldn't be aligned with your own interest. It would also have some strategic value as well, which I think, to me, it's an important thing to discuss in this context.
I don't know. It's funny. I don't think I'm as politically savvy as you guys. I just can't think about those things. I just don't have the energy or patience to think about trying to get into the jury's minds and all that stuff. It's funny because my scheme was Plan B, the first one that I did. Completely, we just couldn't get it to work. It was completely failing. So we had to kind of start over and go towards this one. So I don't know, for me it was just, and this is just, again, my own nature, but I just can't get into that strategizing in that way. I wish I could.
But I'm not talking, I think there's a political side to this, and you can definitely, I would not recommend going into that too much.
Well, I think it also has to do with understanding this kind of discussion in a strategic way, in a tactical way. So it might be what Elena was talking about, although I'm not sure the phraseology really explains. In other words, here's the site. And with a little bit of dexterity, you can do this, or you can do this, or you can do this. You can certainly deal with that in terms of where you locate the building, assuming you don't break it up into pieces, which would be, let's say, for this discussion, precluded, although somebody could have done that. So you're looking at that, and then I think what Marcelo is suggesting is that there may be certain strategic moves. For instance, where you put the building and where the building has been placed heretofore. And I think where Marcelo put the building, so you could look at what the more conventionally plausible location would be for the building, and whether you want to conform to that and do something in one way or another, different, the same, but in that location, because the location has something to do with the consequences of the location. So I think it has to do with thinking about it in a broader way, meaning however different architects are, there may be some organizational limits, at least when you accept the operational constraints of the project, that you're not going to put a concert hall of 2,000 people 10 floors up and make them take elevators. Everybody has to arrive at 7 o'clock or something. It's not going to work. So there has to be, so there's certain, so assuming you pay attention to that, and I think that may be one of the openings in this competition. It's not altogether clear how it would be used or who would use it or how frequently it would be used. I mean, Elena was talking about using that it shouldn't be just, it could be used regularly for all kinds of things, which takes us back to the discussion of openness. And it seems like what Tom did uniquely would define completely every activity that took place within it, because it's all taking place in the same room, which was completely different than the way everybody. I mean, and clearly he understood that and rolled the dice on that. Because we had a discussion, I mean, suppose there's another 10 people, they're out of luck. So everybody is, you know what I mean? So everybody is in a certain venue, which is very precisely defined, organizationally, spatially. And then the other guys are out of luck. They're watching it on closed circuit or something.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember when in the early stages of the competition, the question of like, how many seats do we need to provide? And that was, we're trying to figure out. And I know for me at a certain point, I was just like, you know what, I'm going to provide more than what the number is being asked in terms of this fluctuating demand of the thing. But also it became an opportunity to treat it as a kind of figured field condition, this whole other set of interests. And I think the issue of site, I think that was the first question. And for me, similar to Marcelo, was like that corner offers you the most shadow projection, let's say, onto the rest of the site, the parking lot, and how that thing will begin to interrupt whatever else is happening on there. And that became a kind of opportunity, let's say, for other issues in the project. So I think the issue of siting, the corner, its impact on the rest of the parking lot, as well as the actual corner of SCI-Arc's property on the intersection.
We should probably say a word about Marcelo. I don't know if I said this at the beginning, who won the competition, albeit attempts to lose it. And the jury was Dwayne, Alexis, Ming, Hernan, myself. And so with that cast of characters, everyone had an opinion. But I think from our point of view, the reason that Marcelo's project was given the prize and the commission had to do with its positioning where it was, had to do with the fact that it allowed, given this climate, all sorts of things to happen in the shadow of the piece without obligating you to chase around it. It was infinitely large rather than finite, so it looked like it could work at a smaller scale and not devour everyone, and it looked like it could work at a larger scale. But I think the thing that and people had a tougher time talking about it, I think part of the appeal of it was how it was made and how it was made as an object. And I think there was some sense that the form language of the project, given what we see a lot of in the architecture discussion now, was a genuine effort to find something that we didn't quite recognize. We couldn't quite name and we didn't quite know, that it seems to be a hybrid of a number of possibilities, notwithstanding it had a substantial amount of power as a piece of investigation. It looked to me like something that wasn't finished, and that he didn't quite know how to finish it, and that it would be interesting to see in the process of building it where it would wind up, and it might wind up a little bit differently. I think Tom's looked like Tom knew exactly how to do it, and it was a practiced project, which is not a pejorative, but it's something you've been working on, it's something you recognized form-wise, space-wise, shape-wise, material-wise. So it was more definitive, I think more recognizable both in terms of what you know and in terms of what we know that you've been doing. And I think Elena's was not so recognizable in terms of what Elena is probably recognized for. And in that sense, there was a lot of interest in it, that it seemed to be a kind of departure, and in a way a pragmatic departure, but still a very kind of finite conclusion, notwithstanding the efforts to mitigate that by what you did on the surface. And I think the hardest, the most difficult one to talk about and to understand was Ramiro's. And I think there's a lot of conversation about it, and a lot of uncertainty about what the consequence would be, but there was interest in it. So I mean, just the reason I went through all of that is just to give you a sense, and I'm sure people who are listening, who are on the review, might interpret it a little bit differently. And I think learning about Marcelo's by taking it through a couple of studios and engineering it and constructing it is going to be a terrific lesson for us and for the school, and probably the most important for the architect. And we're interested in where we can, however we can, in being helpful to young architects. And I think we have a chance to do that with that project.